Welcome to a new episode of Thinking in Between, the podcast exploring ideas in the borderlands of health and social science. So you may notice that we've changed our name, so we used to be called the Apollo Social Science Podcast. And this is because we will increasingly be hearing from researchers beyond our group and beyond Queen Mary about the ideas that most influence their thinking and research. So before I introduce today's guest, I also want to take this opportunity to recognise two other podcasts that Thinking in Between emulates. Some of you may have come across the work of Dave Nichols, who leads fascinating work which reconceptualises healthcare, particularly in musculoskeletal, but in other areas of healthcare too. But the idea for this podcast came from a similar structure he uses, which he calls 541 interviews. And that podcast is called Paradoxa, and I recommend it highly. He was really generous when I emailed him about using a similar idea and acknowledged that he took inspiration from Desert Island Discs and was very happy to be emulated again. So today I'm joined by Jackie Walumbe, who is a clinical academic physiotherapist working in pain. And from the start, I don't think I would be here at all if it wasn't for Jackie, because when I was applying for the PhD fellowship that I'm now doing, that gives me time to think about this, I wrote a terrible grant application, which my prospective supervisor, I think, felt like didn't have many legs at all, because I'd never seen what a grant application looked like, and Jackie kindly sent me hers, which proved to be the the template for developing things further. So yeah, I'm particularly grateful to her for that, and very interested to hear about the three ideas she's bringing today. So welcome, Jackie.
Thank you very much. I'm looking forward to it. So how do we do this?
So let's hear about your first idea, which is thinking about critical theory and the nature of our assumptions. And so can you tell me a little bit about when you first came across critical theory and what it's meant for the way that you think and approach research?
Yeah, that's a super interesting question, and I know I raised the three ideas, but I've had a bit of a potted history, so I had a fairly traditional biomedical training in my undergrad and went on to do some postgraduate work in pain, science and society. And throughout that entire degree program, I don't think anyone once mentioned that there was any question that what we were learning, the neuroscience, concepts such as that, and a little bit of psychology, that was just understood to be the truth. What I struggled with was putting that into practice with actual people. So at the time I was working in an area of London with high levels of deprivation, like you'll be really familiar with, and just the principles did not seem to apply at all. So I explored a second postgraduate degree, and I remember really clearly having a lecture from Trish Greenhalgh, and she talked about the nature of our assumptions, and most of the people in the class were just staring blankly at her going, I don't know what she's talking about. And she did something along the lines of put a number of statements up and asked us, is this true or false or something in between? And I fell firmly in the yes, no, fairly binary, fairly... Things are right or they're wrong. There's no relativism at all. But then throughout that program, which was a program in public health, so focused a lot on epidemiology, but there was an interesting module on health, illness and society. And that just really blew my mind, because I was like, what are all these notions that everyone is talking about? So primarily I think around sociology and learning about Nick Parsons and the illness and the distinction between illness and disease and all of this kind of stuff, and even concepts that are quite loose, like social determinants of health, I thought were they just blew my mind. It was groundbreaking, and I immediately wanted to quit my job and go work in public health. But I think that was the slight entry into social theory. And then as I developed in my work, but probably as an early researcher, I was really quite curious about how people were really stuck, and I was questioning the systems, the society and the structures, and how can we focus so much on an individual when there's so much going on. And I think I then drew on what I now understand to be critical theory, and read very, very widely. And I was really lucky to be funded like yourself on a PhD fellowship. So I had the time to spend a lot of time reading and speaking to interdisciplinary colleagues. Clinically, we don't come across people who are not clinicians or administrators. So I really probably grasped onto some of these ideas because they seemed to offer much more meaningful explanations to what I was witnessing and experiencing as a clinician. So always kind of taking the ideas and, I suppose, naturally trying to plug them into my day-to-day work, and then some things would not work or the ideas didn't translate very well. So I've always been kind of straddling a clinical world, which is extremely biomedical, and a social world, because a lot of my patients with chronic pain do not have a solvable or curable disease. Yes. And their experiences are completely varied. And I think one of the key assumptions that I had to let go of was this idea of maladaptive beliefs. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that. Yeah. So in psychology, or should I say behavioural psychology, a lot of pain work draws heavily from behavioural psychology. So pain management programs and are grounded in usually cognitive behavioural therapy or CBT, and more recently they call them third wave therapies or acceptance and commitment therapy. And one of the key tenets of the cognitive behavioural model that I was immersed in and semi-trained in was that people's beliefs were erroneous. So they had the wrong belief about the cause of their pain or about whether their injury had healed, and therefore the thing to address as a clinician was the nature of the maladaptive thoughts.
Right.
So it was, this is education featured very highly. If I just tell you, you will see that I am right in my wisdom, and you will do things differently. So the behaviour change kind of thinking was really, really heavy. As you can imagine, that felt really flat with so many people. Yes. Because people's experiences are grounded in so much. And that, I suppose, would be the biggest pull towards me thinking more about relativism and that things aren't always as they seem. Initially, that they're different perspectives, but also challengingly that there are different realities, not just that people are interpreting them differently. Yes. But perhaps they are just completely different things.
Yes.
And so that was my kind of integration with critical theory. It allowed me to hold fairly odd positions and fairly multiple positions, as I'm sure we'll come on to. Yeah. That was my kind of introduction to critical theory. What I must say is I'm not a sociologist, so I'm not trained in any of these models. So as a clinician, half the things I was reading, I was just completely clueless about. But my supervisors encouraged me to kind of understand some of the key thinkers, how they might have different schools of thought, yes. How those might align or not align, because I was at one point just picking them randomly, and they're probably, eternal enemies or something like that. And along with that, an introduction to philosophy and their kind of intellectual, histories, and so on and so forth. So I think that's all I'll say about that bit.
That's great. And I guess, because I've come across the term critical theory, I guess, being used in different ways. Am I right in understanding it really is just being sort of critiquing assumptions that are made could be towards anything? What would critical theory encapsulate for you?
I would, and I'd very much kind of pin this is in my perspective, because I don't really know what the schools of thought and what the agreement out there is. But for me, initially, I used to think of theory. So, if you do any qualitative work, at some point somebody throws the word theory at you. Yeah. And as a biomedical person, you're like, I don't have a theory. Is it a hypothesis? This kind of real tussle with language.
Yes.
So what I think I take to be critical theory is any kind of thinking that allows you to shape your view of the world. And the critical part of it, for me, is something about questioning the standard norms and knowledges in a particular field. So for me, in physiotherapy, but more broadly in pain and the umbrella of biomedicine, I think is starting to challenge things around determinism of biology and psychology and the absence of social understandings was quite prominent in my work. So I think because I'm taking a slightly other than perspective, I would say that's my interpretation of critical theory.
Yeah. No, that's really helpful. And just kind of coming back to that, CBT, like change your thinking and your pain will get better. Was there anything particular that you read, any particular aspects of critical theory there that helped you to, I guess, perhaps put into words what you already felt was wrong about that or wasn't working about that? Like, was there anything that just particularly illuminated what the disjuncture was there?
Well, okay, let's use the example from my PhD project. So when I first started my project, my intention was to look at how these concepts could be made more accessible to people who didn't have access to them. The assumption being that it was good.
Right.
So that pain management was a good thing.
Okay.
And that, and when I use the word pain management, I mean the field or the idea that you come along to a program where there's elements of education and skills development and perhaps a little bit of rehabilitation. And at the end of that, people do this thing that was termed in my area of work as self-management.
Yeah.
Right? So I went into it thinking that how do we improve access to self-management for people, particularly people from marginalised groups, people coming from, really difficult lives with poverty, difficulties with literacy, etc. So that was my intention. So then, and also, again, not at all questioning that there was anything contentious or what's the word, problematic about the view that we were using. And so I started by doing a literature review using hermeneutic principles, and I apologise because I'm not going to start throwing in all the strange words, but ask me for clarification. So I wanted to do a review of the literature, but because it's quite vast, when I first searched for self-management and pain, there are hundreds and thousands of papers, and guided by my supervisors, I was encouraged to kind of abandon the idea of doing it systematically, which is kind of how you're supposed to do things, is count things and establish the effect sizes and then off you go. So it took me the entire duration of my PhD reading about self-management, and this is where the it's not the critique, but where the kind of question mark started to start, because when I looked through what I assumed would be fairly well-established principles, that was not born in the literature, and that's across multiple health conditions. And when it came to pain, it completely disassembled.
Right.
So things that I had assumed would make sense just didn't. So if I asked myself, what did I think self-management was? No answer. I had no answer.
Okay.
And I asked a few colleagues just in the course of my workday, what is self-management? And almost no one could say what it was. So people would either equate it with what it says on the tin, so managing the self in some way. The majority of the people in specialist practice, which is where I'm based clinically, would kind of say, well, it's kind of the same as a pain management program, or what the people who are not medics, it's what they do.
Okay.
So that was really interesting to me. I was like, oh, so the doctors, when I say doctors, I mean medical doctors, so they don't do self-management, and the consensus was that no. So in the literature, self-management, the findings on the tin kind of suggested that it had multiple meanings and that they were self-evident, or this word received wisdom, which I really quite enjoy, that people just assumed you all know what I'm talking about when I say self-management.
Yes.
It's a good thing, and we should all strive to do that. And what I found was that this term, even though there was no kind of consensus or accepted practice about how it could be done, it was adopted in the policy. It was widespread in commissioning documents. It was on pretty much every website that suggested how people should or could live with pain. Self-management was really prominent, to the point that I was almost going against, I suppose, the most dominant thinking by suggesting that, hang on a minute, people, should we delve a little bit deeper? So that's kind of where I'd say the critical thing started at that point, and then just kind of escalated a little bit, because I thought, well, if I don't know what self-management is, what is pain? And did a big exploration about pain, which I ended up calling an epistemological inquiry, because how did I know about what pain is, and how would that be different to my colleague who might have been trained slightly differently or somewhere else, or to my patients or their carers? So that, I would say, is where it started. And then as I spoke to more and more people, the language developed. Like I started to understand, so when people say these words that I was terrified of saying before, they're really good shorthand for helping people understand what I'm saying. So I can say epistemic humility.
Right.
And hope that some people in the room would know what I was speaking about.
Yes.
But again, because I'm a clinician, I do have to make sure I can try and translate those concepts into what I would call plain English. Even though I acknowledge that even in the world of pain, we still got our own little shorthand, like self-management.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Okay. That's great. And I think that might lead us nicely or closely towards your second idea, which I want to ask you about, which is about the concept of multiplicity. And I don't know if this is about what you were saying before, of maybe the thing that people are referring to that is called the same thing might actually be lots of different things. So then, or whether this is multiplicity in different ways. But could you say a little bit about what multiplicity means for you and how it's helped you to see your research and your practice differently?
Okay, so this is a tough one. So I forgive all the actual scholars out there who have a deep grounding in this language. But for me, when I think of multiplicity, very much of multiple. So the ideas emerged from, I started with there being like, okay, there's a diversity of thought. Very much feeling very proud of myself for being very liberal in accepting other people's versions of events. And then that's kind of developed more because of understanding those two concepts that we spoke about earlier. So the idea that there's a difference between reality and how reality is known. Yeah. So should I say the unto word?
Yeah, why not? Okay. Why not? Yeah.
So for me, exploring ideas about ontology, so the nature of reality and what something is, not how something is interpreted, helped me to separate these ideas from really that practice of thinking that this is an interpretation to no, this constitutes someone's reality. And the thinker that I found really helpful along those lines was reading Annemarie Moll's book, The Body Multiple, which she structured really well for my brain, because I think trying to integrate the two worlds for me was getting a little bit, I was rocking in my chair most nights and going, I don't know how to analyse my data. I don't know what is helpful other than describing what I was seeing on the tin. And for those of you who will know, the book is split into you could read it as two separate books. So the top half describing an ethnography that Annemarie did in a hospital environment and the technologies and following the disease of atherosclerosis. And the bottom half was this really lovely explanation of some of these kind of concepts. And the key thing from that particular book was saying that atherosclerosis is different things. It's not just interpreted differently, but it is, she uses this phrase that I really like, that reality is done. It's not something that is very cognitive and, let's interpret and thought experiments, but by observing characters going about their day-to-day lives with this disease, the laboratory version of atherosclerosis was very different from the one in a consultation with a patient, from the one in the radiology kind of department. And that was contained within a hospital kind of environment. So I just used to read this book and go, oh my goodness, this is so helpful. And this the nature of this idea of ontological conflict, where these realities are so far apart in conceptualization that when the two meet, you then get this kind of conflict that is fairly visible in kind of practice. And that work was then taken a little bit further by, his name is Scott Graham. As far as I understand, he's got a very interesting background. I think he's a rhetorician, and I'm not sure that we have those here. But
what does that mean?
I'm not entirely sure.
Okay.
Do you know, I've Googled it a few times, but I think it's something to do with the language.
Okay, like rhetoric?
I think,
okay.
But it's just, we've tried to unpack it. I was going to tweet him, and then I got tired and got scared of Twitter, so I didn't do it, or should I say X. But the idea in his book, he called it the politics of pain. And he did a very similar thing. So he did an ethnographic exploration, but this time of pain, as it was done in somewhere in the Midwest of the United States, and really broad exploration of how pain was done in that kind of setting. And he set out these 5 different ontologies that he observed or could see working through that process. So it was very helpful to have those characterizations of what multiplicity could be like. And then since then, speaking to colleagues, I was lucky enough to go on a research trip over to Australia and spend some time with Karame Mascuto, who is also a physiotherapist, working with very similar concepts. Her research is focused on back pain care. But again, we spoke and we both were like, yeah, there's so much going on here. It's not what we used to think it was biomedical, and then there was biopsychosocial, just to spice things up a little bit. So speaking to her, that then exposed me to slightly different philosophical concepts, and where the origin of these ideas of multiplicity may have come from. Like I said, I'm not a philosopher, I'm not extensively read, but speaking to Jenny Setchell while I was over there, who was a scholar as well, and Karame's supervisor at the time, and coincidentally one of my PhD examiners, that was the kind of work that they were exploring in quite a lot of detail. And, the books that we're going to talk about shortly, I presume, really tangly and messy texts. But I found that I just really enjoyed that. I found that actually I don't have to have one single way of thinking. So one disciplinary practice was not even necessary. So if I think back to your question around multiplicity for me, that also is seen in I suppose my professional identity.
Yes.
So even as I was doing all my reflective journals and trying to work out, who am I and what am I doing, and settling on actually I don't have to be one thing.
Yes.
I can be multiple things at different times, sometimes at the same time, and that is all conceivable. So those, that way of thinking of multiples and multiple realities rather than multiple conceptualizations became a really big thing for me in my analysis and with my data. So I don't use a single theorist. It's a little bit wild, or in the words of Deleuze and Guattari, a little bit schizophrenic. So there's quite a lot of stuff in my thinking within my thesis anyway, where I'd go, actually that piece of data really aligns with this stuff I've read, and that stuff that feels different, and that stuff that feels different. So all my chapters are extremely different, but I think they are linked with this idea of multiplicity. And I'm doing it now. So rather than thinking with but, it's thinking with and. So adding to analysis, adding to ideas rather than one surpassing the other. And I think that just really helped because I work within medicine. I just don't think you can throw the baby out of the bathwater because it's still really relevant. And as a physiotherapist, this really strong attachment of my profession to biomechanics, which is very separate for me to biomedicine. It's literally the body is a machine and we can fix it and chop and change at it. So I think having those multiple perspectives allowed me to name all the different things I was seeing and to allow them to kind of be in conversation with each other at the same time.
We're going to land then on the ideas of thinking with theory and assemblages, and particularly picking up the work of Deleuze and Guattari, who I find very scary. I've tried reading a few things, not their work directly, but work about them or listening to people talk about them, and I've never really been able to quite get to grips with their ideas. So I am really looking forward to you telling me a bit about what their work means to you and how their work and this work has helped you see things differently.
Yes, I'm regretting my life choices. Do you know the idea of ideas of Deleuze and Guattari, particularly their book? I don't even know we can call it a book, but that's for the initiated. 1,000 Plateaus came to me because I was speaking to someone about this struggle with interpreting my data and the fact that it was not linear. And that there were so many kind of offshoots, and it just depends what's happening and how I look at the data, and this difficulty with the idea of rigor in qualitative research is that for it to be proper scientific, you should have a really good tradition that it is anchored in. And if I'm honest, I did it the complete opposite way. I had data, and then I wrote what I thought was a lovely summary of my analysis, and my supervisors came back and said, that's really nice. It's a little bit thin and atheoretical. And so I had to go away and try and match a theory retrospectively alongside some stuff I'd already read. So I suppose this was more of an abductive type of analysis that Tivor and Tim and someone, I can't think of their names right now, they kind of proposed it. So I was trying to find anything that captures multiplicity, messiness, the lack of order, complicated histories, linking things together. And I was reading a couple of philosophies more around phenomenology, Merleau-Ponty, and all that kind of history around Heidegger, and I was just finding it fairly interesting, but it wasn't kind of ringing true. And in one of these conversations with someone suggested a phrase, or I think it must have been a podcast, because I'm very similar to you. I kind of need someone to say it out to me before I know what's going on. And I just really got struck by their ideas, particularly number one was around an assemblage and then the idea of a rhizome, and then decided to go delve into it. And as I was doing that, I thought, well, this is great. This is exactly what I think I want to know. And I think it fit, or it matched the state of my mind at the time. Is I could just dip into it, dip out of it. I didn't have to really understand it fully. I'm sure the proper Deleuzean scholars out there are cringing and hurting themselves. But like you, I took some of those ideas, then looked at some of their more contemporary people who had interpreted it.
Yeah.
And then read that, then worked my way back to, well, I kind of like this, but not as much as the original. So with Assemblages, it was the work of Ian Buchanan, who is a philosopher, I believe, and trying to make sense of, okay, assemblage seems important, because my question was, how are people with self-management, or how are people with chronic pain doing this thing that I'm not even sure what it is, but it's called self-management. So how are they living with pain? And through my data, just to give people an idea, I did I'm going to call it a digital ethnography, because it was during COVID, the pandemic. I followed people who were living with pain. Mostly they were at home, as most of us were, but they followed, they showed me their homes, they showed me all the things that they did all day, every day to live with their pain. And probably because of a function of the pandemic, they tended to show me a lot of objects. So they showed me the tools that they used to make things that mattered to them, things like crafts and wheelbarrows and bikes, and allotments showed up quite a lot. And I think I was going, well, these come up a lot, but we don't really talk about them. And relevant, I suppose, to the Apollo project, a lot of medicines came up. People were showing me medicines, but telling me how they didn't work, or they didn't help, but they took them. And then they'd walk me, for example, the route to the pharmacy to pick up their medications, etc., etc. So I had a really big, rich data set, and I was like, I could do some themes, but nope. I wasn't in the mood for themes. And so this idea of the assemblage really struck me, because they were continually bringing different objects in and out of their life, people in and out of their lives. Their lives were influenced by policy decisions all the time, and you could almost follow that through the data and see it happening and changing their reality. So one person's living with pain wasn't the same after 6 months, because things had changed. So I kind of played with the idea of bringing all these different components, not just to kind of form assemblage in the sense of what it sounds like a thing that is assembled, but also that this had a function, that these collections of ideas, objects, people, policies, etc., they formed something.
Okay.
And what was the function of that something?
And is that what an assemblage is? Just, yeah.
Theoretically,
okay,
yes. In my takeaway
Yeah.
of the assembly, of the assemblage. So I suppose I was looking for, there was something about these metaphors that they used, Deleuze and Guattari, that I found quite helpful. I don't know why. Maybe because I'm a fairly visual creature. But they talked, because I was looking at this idea of the self. And so the notion of self-management kind of just went out the window, because no one was doing this alone. No one was doing this in the way that I had conceived it, with lovely coping strategies and they were doing some really complicated and messy things, and some of the time their lives were interrupted every time they interacted with healthcare. So they might have been doing all right until something else came into their assemblage that suggested that, no, you have a new diagnosis.
Yes.
You have rheumatoid arthritis. So now you have to stop the thing you were doing, which was lifting weights, that was making you very happy, because now you have rheumatoid arthritis, and now you must take these tablets. And just following through on this journey. So that Assemblages was probably my shortest. It was a short chapter. It was fairly, I I want to call it descriptive. So yes, there's very heavy theory, but I think it's easy to read because it's, this is an assemblage of Jane on a Tuesday.
Yes.
And this is how Jane shows up based on this particular arrangement. So for me, that's where I found that really interesting. And I hate to say this, but I am going to say it because I did use their idea, but the notions of how territorialization and deterritorialization, these are terms Deleuze and Guattari use, that really indicate how, I'm going to use the word people because I have to, I don't know how else to do it, how people can be shaped or brought into one way of thinking, and then they can depart from it and then come back in and depart from it. And so for me, the territorialization and deterritorialization really reflected what I was seeing in the data of how people were trying to get away from biomedical ideas and then kind of being roped right back in, whether that's because there was a new policy on sick notes or PWP. What does that stand for? PIP. It's a disability benefit. So those, you could see that actively creating bodies that were really struggling.
Right.
Even though the people themselves had this plan, they were going to be different or do different. And then the last concept that I played around with, not so successfully, was the body without organs, but that's all I'm going to say about it.
Okay, wow. Yeah. That's really helpful. I'm kind of able to, I like what you say of like the assemblage of Jane on a Tuesday. That helps me kind of, I think, understand how you might enact that idea a bit more than I've got it before. Is there any way in which you continue to think with these ideas as you are back doing more clinical work at the moment, or did it more help you see things when you were doing the sort of academic writing and analysis?
I think it's fundamentally changed me as a practitioner, as a clinician. Ideas that I would have held really, really closely to me because I've been trained that way. I have numbers, or not numbers, letters even after my name, and there's a certain currency in having worked for 20 whatever years, and I would have held those ideas fairly strongly. Whereas now, I'm pretty sure nothing would shock me. It's like somebody would come up with a narrative or their story, which in pain is not uncommon. They would be like, I think I had an operation, and my belief is the surgeons took my arm off, then they put it back on, so it's inherently unstable. And I would probably just be like, well, that sounds scary. It changes because I'm just like, well, who am I to say what happened or didn't happen? So that's in relation to patients. I can still hold on to my profession. I know what I'm supposed to be doing. And if, for example, our ideas are completely like on a different end of a spectrum. So if someone comes in kicking and screaming and they tell me, I don't know why I'm seeing you as a physiotherapist, I need to be seeing the surgeon, I would go, I'm so sorry. Let's see if we can arrange that for you, because that's where that person is at that time in their assemblage or whatever thinking I'm holding on to. So it's multiplicity, this idea of rhizomes, it's the only thing I can express is just a fairly mentality.
Yeah.
And when I observe conflict in multidisciplinary teams, so I'm part of many, 3 or 4 different multidisciplinary teams, you can see the conflict arises from, they're just talking about 2 different things today. It's just not the same debate here. Someone's talking, for example, about cauda symptoms. Somebody else is talking about something else. And you can see the conflict arising and one of the other ideas I used to try and make sense of what happens in clinical environments was how we try and resolve that conflict. So when conflict is present, this ontological conflict, is we tend to invent even newer concepts to try and patch up okay, I think what we're talking about here is quote unquote self-management.
Okay, or biopsychosocial.
Or biopsychosocial,
right.
or a new one for that we're following with a few different colleagues is psychologically informed.
Okay.
Psychologically informed practice. So that's another thing. So rather than doing the messy work, I think it's just so much easier to go, look, we just need to get through the day and do what's best for our patients. So we're just going to name something.
Yes.
And also things like pain management programs. If you go and read what they constitute of, there's no consensus, but it's held very, very strongly as a gold standard. It's in the nice guidelines. It's, picked up and replicated now into digital models and digital spheres. Is suddenly we now have apps and entire things commissioned by the NHS for digitally enabled self-management. And I sit there going, but what is it?
Yeah, it's fascinating. I mean, it strikes me, I'd be interested to know if you think this is part of it. It strikes me that there's, in a sense, part of your posture changes to feel like the world is much less controllable by you, like it's much less fixable, it's much less, like the example you gave of someone coming in and saying, I need to see a surgeon, rather than being like, right, I need to get them from A to B, to be more like, I've got no idea how it feels to be like in your shoes right now, so I'm just going to go with where you are. And in some ways, it must be quite a releasing thing to not sort of feel you've got to stick with the program that in inverted commas you should be doing. But I guess it's also tricky when it feels like people are maybe that there's this kind of communal sense that you are all on the same page and you're all doing the same thing, but then you're the one that are thinking, I don't think we actually are here, but am I the only one seeing this? So I don't know, it feels like the difficulties for you being in the room are in a different place to where they would have been 10 years ago, perhaps. I don't know.
I would agree with that. So earlier on in my career, I'd just be really stubborn and loud-spoken, and this is wrong, an advocate for people. And now I'm probably as loud, but just less opinionated. Right. So it's more, I'm just saying, I just think we should all consider that what would happen if we did things differently within the parameters of what we're allowed to do. So I'm not saying let's go and invent something else entirely. And one of the ideas that I'm taking forward from this is, if I accept that reality is multiple and that there are multiple ontologies of pain, that someone can really strongly hold a reality that theirs is a biomechanical problem, and someone else can hold the idea that theirs is a biochemical problem, and somebody can think it is a spiritual, they've been cursed problem. If that is all potentially true, where is the place of healthcare in supporting all of those people? And perhaps arguing that for pain, chronic and persistent pain, then healthcare is probably not the environment for some of those people because it doesn't match. Yes. There's no balance between what they think is going on and the potential solution. And speaking to general practitioners in particular, they are very cognizant and see how societal big S issues impact on people's day-to-day health or pain problems, and therefore they might not choose to intervene at that level. Let's not send people to pain clinics, for example. That might not be the best thing for this particular group of people, not for all people. And so not one thing is for everyone, which is very against our kind of evidence-based model, but it is fairly selective. And if we were to broaden the offer of what, so speaking to a colleague, Gemma Hughes, on how people make decisions about their healthcare. So if we were to broaden the offer with the caveat that we do some work to define and describe what we mean by harm, so as to not cause harm or distress. If we are able to conceptualize what harm is in those spheres, perhaps that opens up some possibilities. And, I talk a lot about reimagining pain care, using reimagining very deliberately, because it's not doing a little bit better of what we already do. But if we kind of Deleuze and Guattari the whole thing and explore very different possibilities, what is possible, especially with pain, because of that really long loop I talked about, is if we're getting to the point where we're saying, there's some really complex cognitive neuroscience processes that mean that we're probably contributing to our reality, that we shape our reality, our minds and our environments shape our reality. Can we do more, not to the self, not intervene at the self level, but at all those kind of other levels, which is some of the work from Peter Stilwell, the inactivism model, is, environment, architecture. Some people say VR, but, the different camps.
Okay.
So, it offers some options. So that's kind of where I think I'm going to try and get someone to give me some money to look at.
I was about to ask you what's next, but I think is there anything else you'd want to kind of end on in terms of what's next for you in terms of exploring ideas and pain?
I think the idea of harm, I think is fairly interesting, because outside medicine, I'm not sure we spend a lot of time thinking about harm. There's a lot of claims that things are harmful in physical rehabilitation literature, but we don't really, harms according to who, like which epistemic position, etc., etc. I think that would be something I'd be quite curious about, especially in relation to medicines is the first project that we're kind of wanting to look at, because if medicines are more harmful, quote unquote, than helpful, how do we support people when the system is set up to provide only medicines? So that would be like one idea, and maybe expand that into more, different groups, because they have epistemic injustice positions, so their ideas are not always heard. So when we think about the constructed reality at the moment, it might exclude quite a number of different voices. And I'm just curious, I'm just nosy. I would like to speak to a lot of people, spend time with a lot of people to better understand the breadth of possibilities. And maybe that will keep going till I retire.
Wow. Thank you so much, Jackie. I really appreciate you coming and sharing today. It's been really fascinating. Thank you.
You're very welcome. Thanks for having me.
Thank you everyone for listening in today. We will be back with a new episode of Thinking in Between soon, and please feel free to subscribe through any podcast platform if you want to be updated when the next episode is out.